All right, we unpack really that development. And for that, we're joined by Wits School of Governance's Dr. Thelela Ngcetane-Vika, who joins us via Zoom. Good evening to you, Doctor. A good, really interesting conversation that we're looking forward to having here, because one cannot deny that this has been, perhaps you can say, one of the more colourful US ambassadors that we have had in South Africa, very vocal on numerous issues. In fact, it's sometimes ruffling some of our leadership feathers, right? But talk to us about your surprise, or your, I suppose, if you were surprised hearing about his resignation, or is he correct that this is standard procedure according to your understanding?
Yes, I mean, I can't say good evening to all your viewers. I wasn't necessarily surprised, especially at the backdrop of the elections in the United States on the 5th of November with President Donald Trump as an elect. So obviously the current US ambassador to South Africa, was appointed by President Biden. As you would know, ambassadors really serve at the pleasure of presidents. So it was inevitable.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, either he would not be sent back, deployed back to South Africa. So it was just, it's just normal, if you like it, in politics, yes.
Standout moments in his tenure? I think I can guess where you're going to take it, but give us your thoughts on that.
It's been a very interesting tenure, especially if one looks at the very seemingly very good tenure of Patrick Gaspard. We had very good relationship. Who can forget that December 2022 saga, the Lady R, at the dock in the Simon's Town, and what it caused, the stir, especially given the dynamic bilateral relations between South Africa and the United States, especially with the non-alignment in inverted commas, and also the view, at least from the United States, that South Africa is seemingly warm towards Russia, towards Iran, and also the Palestine war. So, of course, there were some good policies that he strengthened, especially AGOA, as much as it is still up for renewal next year. So who knows with the incoming President Donald Trump, whether that will remain. So it's really been a very progress, a very complicated relationship with this ambassador. Do you remember the time the former minister, Naledi Pandor, had to really literally rush to Washington trying to calm the storms during that USSA bilateral relations review bill, which could have really brought some hostility to the bilateral relations. So he's followed with that legacy, this ambassador.
Yeah, I wonder what he did for US-South African relations. And of course, you talk about AGOA. We're still on that boat, up for review very soon. Of course, and that conversation becomes an ongoing one. And we'll get into that a little bit later. But if we go back to that Lady R saga, my goodness, what a heated talking point in our country, And I remember the minister in the presidency, Khumbudzo Ntshavheni, coming out, at some point even saying that South Africa is not a state of the USA. And I wonder what you think he did for, I suppose, how vocal and decisive even our leadership here in South Africa had to be in the discussion around geopolitics.
I think this ambassador, one of his predicament was that he came at the time the bilateral relations between the US and South Africa has been really hostile. Even Republicans from Congress feeling that there's this more, cozy relationship between South Africa and US, rather with China, Russia, and, Iran, and these are their, enemies, if you like. So he comes at that time where there's that hostility, and his own impulses, if you like, didn't help much. But perhaps two or three things one can talk about. There was some strengthening on investment, although not extensively like before. There's also, the continuation of AGOA as it stands. As I said earlier, whether that will continue from next year is up in the air. And so there was some economic interest because, of course, South Africa is critical as a gateway in Africa, a very sophisticated economy in Africa. So it continues to be critical for the US. Of course, the fact that China and Russia are causing up, if you like, sort of courting South Africa, always pose a challenge to Washington, such that Washington doesn't want to let go of that relationship. AGOA is still here. Whether AGOA will continue with the Trump presidency, we can't know. We don't have crystal ball. I think it's up in the air.
Yeah, and that was going to be the next question. But of course, as you say, it is up in the air, and that's going to be a really tough conversation to tackle for the incoming ambassador, of the US to South Africa. But I want to look at just a few more highlights, and I'm going to read that out. He talks about, in a statement around his resignation, he says, we've strengthened US-South Africa higher education partnerships among over 120 universities and colleges and funded over 54 million rand in joint research, academic exchange, and curriculum development. So just a moment to reflect on some of the work that was done there between the two countries. Let's expand the discussion, if you will, Doctor, just a little bit, because certainly now the world really looking closely in the past 2-3 years, I think, at what South Africa does with its foreign relations, right? And at the moment, the president is in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. He's going to take over for the country the presidency of G20, a mammoth, big responsibility that is on us for 2025. Talk to me about the opportunities and really the red flags that we need to be watching out for in that responsibility.
Yes, the first part of your question on other contributions that perhaps his tenure would have added value to South Africa, that would include, amongst others, as you have mentioned, the exchanges between education, which continues to be important, and it's been one of the hallmarks of these bilateral relations. Of course, the United States has contributed massively on the AIDS pandemic before COVID. Of course, there's also been some working relationship with COVID. But if we're looking at the G20 that we will be hosting, and the president, as you're saying, is in Brazil, and in 2025, with President Trump in office in the United States, South Africa then becomes the chair. It's going to be interesting. And I've been watching some news all over the world. The question has been posed whether would it be the first time that a President Trump will be heading to Africa? As you know, in his first term, he didn't. Whether G20 would be that significant event. G20 is critical for any country. And South Africa, I mean, no doubt that for us to be chairing it is critical for a number of things, for geopolitics, for us trying to yield some power, especially with the multipolar that's emerging with the BRICS and BRICS expansion, amongst others. And that BRICS expansion has jittered the global north, if you like, and also with the dynamics with the wars in Ukraine, the war in Gaza. So it's very, very, very important at many levels. It's good for South Africa. Whether then we will be able to yield something of significance, really, it remains to be seen. But G20, hosting a G20 is incredibly important for any country. And the last question you ask about South Africa's foreign policy. South Africa's foreign policy has always been non-alignment, and often people misinterpret non-alignment for neutrality. Non-alignment is not being neutral. This is why then South Africa took the Netanyahu administration to the ICJ. It's not necessarily aligned to any, but they derive their policy from the UN Charter and also from South Africa's democracy known to be founded on principles of equality, non-discrimination, and all those kind of things. But that policy is very, very complicated because you saw how that Russia-Ukraine war was really uncomfortable within the US levers of power. And that continues to be.
Yeah. Is it possible, though, that the question for the president certainly will arise around the recent BRICS summit in Russia? taking place, that very contentious issue that even the Democratic Alliance came up and said, no, we don't support that, when the president said, well, we have a long friendship with Russia. And then, of course, this, one would call it even a slaughter of that missile attack recently from Russia into the Ukraine. If you've seen the images of it, just stark, frightening. If that question could come up, though, under a Trump administration, what does the president say? Because it's one thing to say non-alignment, but when you're quoted as saying we are longtime friends with Russia.
Yes, it's really going to be interesting, but let's also track back and we look at Trump as policies for his campaign. It seemed to me he's advocating for de-escalation at the very least, or at best, attempts to end the war, especially in Ukraine, it would seem to me. But, well, today's decision or yesterday's decision by Biden to allow Ukraine to use the long-range weapons then can really escalate the tensions in Russia-Ukraine. So maybe we can then speculate that a Trump presidency can lead to some de-escalation, because remember, Trump is more about national interest, protectionism, less about, your international order, and hence there were many challenges even with NATO and with the counterparts at NATO. So maybe we can see a de-escalation, because if you're not funding the wars, as the Biden administration has been, providing weapons, then you sort of close the tab that can end to some form of de-escalation. But we'll see when he starts office in January whether these things will come to fruition, because politicians, it's one thing to campaign, it's another when they're in office.
Very, very true. Doctor, it's been such a pleasure speaking to you, and thank you so much for your time. We look forward to engaging. And as you said, it's going to be an interesting 2025. I guess we'll chat a lot more as we get closer and closer to the new year. Wits School of Governance's Dr. Thelela Ngcetane-Vika speaking to us on that story, opening the doorway, of course, for us to give you more of that G20 coverage. Stay with us.